Welcome. If I to please settle down. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you today to our event at the United Nations in celebration of our International Day for Persons with Disability. My name is Jennifer Stansel. I'm part of the Office of Human Resources in the United Nations Secretariat. I'm a woman, I'm wearing a black dress and a red necklace. And we have a wonderful, engaging event planned for you today. I will lead you through the agenda today as an MC, and I have my partner in crime with me over there all the way at the end, Jim, who will be the MC with me today. We will have a break at 2:45, so we have 2 segments to our agenda today. And there will be some teas and coffee served at that time. The toilets are outside to the left and right, and they're accessible toilets. Today, let's reflect on the progress made towards disability inclusion in our workplaces, the challenges faced, good practices, and the way forward. And let's continue to ask ourselves, are we doing enough, and can we do better? We will start off with the opening remarks from Marta Helena Lopez, Assistant Secretary General for Human Resources. And I'm handing over to Marta Helena. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everyone, excellencies, delegates, partners, and distinguished guests. It is my deep pleasure to welcome you to this year's International Day event. It warms my heart to be here with you today in person for 2 years of holding these events virtually. This year again, we have gathered to celebrate and mobilize support for the dignity, rights, and well-being of persons with disabilities. As we celebrate, we also want to use this platform to draw attention to the gaps that still exist for persons with disability in many areas, including in employment. 80% of the world's 1 billion persons with disabilities are of working age, with many remaining unemployed due to barriers. Advancement of employment of persons with disability is critical to the achievement of the SDGs and to our promise to leave no one behind. This year's theme on transformative solutions for inclusive development, the role of innovation in fueling an accessible and equitable world, is very fitting. It reminds us that at the launch of the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy in 2019, we pledged to achieve transformational change for persons with disabilities and make the United Nations an employer of choice. The Disability Inclusion Strategy details our objectives and approach to disability inclusion, including specific action on the employment of persons with disabilities. The United Nations is committed to achieving those objectives. We believe transformative solutions through innovation will play a significant role in our ability to build truly equitable, inclusive workspaces. Building an inclusive and equitable society requires an ecosystem of stakeholders, such as policymakers, industry experts, innovators, and civil society, with persons with disability at the center of the ecosystem. Events such as this provide the platform for an ecosystem to grow and achieve our collective targets, so that the needs of persons with disability are heard and the best solutions are developed and successfully integrated into all areas. For us, this concretely means engaging persons with disabilities in the workforce and actively seeking their perspective as we design the next phase of our collective future. It also means enhancing the cultures of our organizations and mainstreaming inclusion in all aspects of our operations. I take this opportunity to stress the need for stronger partnerships with the UN, with the United Nations and other ecosystem players to ensure that transformative solutions go from drawing boards into our workspaces. The responsibility lies with each of us to ensure that there are no barriers to inclusion for persons with disabilities. I look forward to an engaging and insightful afternoon and learning from all our partners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta Helena Lopez. I'd now like to hand over to Assistant Secretary General for General Assembly and Conference Management, Sheriff Norman Shelley. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Distinguished delegates, participants, dear colleagues. It is a pleasure to be representing the Department for General Assembly and Conference Management here today on this important day that we take to celebrate and promote the rights of persons with disabilities. We're very grateful to the Office of Human Resource Management for organizing today's events and for their leadership role as the Secretariat's policy arm in the strategic area of inclusion. As a front-facing department of the United Nations Secretariat, DGACM is firmly committed to disability inclusion and awareness in all areas of our work and strive to ensure this daily. I am very pleased that today's event is taking place for the first time, again in person, because it is imperative that we continue to raise awareness and increase our understanding of the significant barriers that persons with disabilities continue to face. And it's truly through this awareness and understanding can we implement the vision that the Secretary General has laid out and reflected in the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy and bring about those practical and tangible changes needed to ensure that the full participation of persons with disabilities on an equal basis with persons without disabilities. Today's event, as the Assistant Secretary for Human Resources said, provides us an excellent opportunity to reflect and take stock of our efforts to advance transformative solutions for inclusive development and the role of innovation in fueling an accessible and equitable world, but especially our efforts to ensure accessible and equitable employment. Coming out of COVID and the experiences and the lessons learned, it only confirmed that technology is a crucial enabler of accessibility and inclusion. But prior to that, DGACM has pursued an innovation effort to automate multiple processes and ensure that the benefits of this automation are equally shared and serve to empower staff with disabilities. Our vision of a modern, diverse, and fully empowered workforce is one that conducts its work in a barrier-free environment, a workforce that welcomes all, a workforce that thrives by helping all to fully contribute, and a workforce that leaves no one behind. And to inform and advance our work in these areas, DGACM continues to work with representatives of the disability community and ensures that our competitive exam is one example of our efforts in this regard. For language positions are conducted remotely. They use an accessible system which gives candidates the opportunity to take the exam from home without traveling to test centers. And the exams are anonymous and have already identified suitable candidates with disabilities who have been hired. But apart from our efforts to ensure employment opportunities are barrier-free, our key remit and mandate is to ensure that persons with disabilities have equal access to UN meetings and events such as this, and are able to fully participate in decision-making on behalf of the member states, organizations, and groups that they represent. And to this end, we have taken a number of initiatives and made a concerted effort to realize tangible outcomes during this past year. Some of this includes improving our registration systems, such as Indico.UN and eDelegate, and our production of UN documents, by making our flagship in-house web-based translation interface more accessible to persons with disability, fine-tuning our procedures to ensure accessible seating in the General Assembly hall and conference rooms, providing sign interpretation to meetings that have such budgetary entitlements and other meetings on request where funding is provided, further refining our means to support virtual participation of persons with disability, and providing more accessibility services for on-site events, and generally providing support through the UN Headquarters Accessibility Center, which is hosted by DGACM, to ensure that seamless support for all who rely on it. We also have engaged the Office of the President of the General Assembly and organized a training session on accessibility and sensitivity awareness for delegates and for UN staff this past June to raise awareness. But I would say always, even with all of these efforts, we know that there still is a ways to go in terms of providing more services and covering a wider scope, especially in the digital domain, but also employing with persons with disabilities. And I know that's the focus of today's event. We are firmly, and the department is firmly committed to advancing our efforts in this regard and working with our colleagues, the member states, the PGA's Steering Committee on Accessibility, and the broader community in advancing these efforts. And I very much look forward to listening to the views and discussions today. And thank you very much, Marta Elena.
Thank you so much. We now have a video from the United Nations volunteers.
The United Nations Volunteers Programme is pleased to join our partners in commemorating the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, a day that highlights global efforts all year round to promote the rights and well-being of persons with disabilities. We are making progress and have achievements to celebrate, but are we doing enough? This event today coincides with the International Volunteer Day and is therefore a prime opportunity for UNV to recommit to increasing the access for persons with disabilities to volunteering opportunities and sustainable employment, free from discrimination. Since 2017, we have proactively embraced inclusion and raised awareness of social engagement, volunteer actions, and employability prospects for persons with disabilities. In 2018 to 19, together with UNDP, we deployed 12 UN volunteers in UNDP country offices under this UNV-UNDP Talent and Capacity Development Program. Learning valuable lessons from the initial deployments under this talent program, in 2021 to 22, we deployed 190 more UN volunteers who self-declare as persons with disabilities in need of reasonable accommodations and support. These UN volunteers served with 22 UN entities in 84 countries and territories. A big part of these volunteers were generously funded by our donors, and I take this opportunity to express our appreciation for the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development and the Swedish International Development Agency. In Sudan, a national volunteer is supporting the implementation of UNFPA's strategic plan and the Youth, Peace and Security Program by drafting conflict analysis, risk assessment, and political analysis and proposed interventions. In Fiji, a UN volunteer is assigned to OHCHR as Disabilities Rights Officer and is working on the promotion of the Convention of the Rights for People with Disabilities, organizing and delivering related capacity building events. Inspired by the UN Disabilities Inclusion Strategy of 2019, UNV has put in place policies and procedures to ensure a safe and inclusive environment for all UN volunteers with disabilities. Our partners hosting these volunteers have a major role to play, from designing appropriate assignment and putting reasonable accommodations in place to ensuring that the UN volunteers can thrive in a supportive environment. Based on feedback received from our volunteers, UNV is also committed to improving the accessibility to UNV services and web applications, training and learning opportunities, and more networking among UN volunteers. Our UN volunteers bring fresh perspectives to UN country offices. UN colleagues are often amazed by how resilient, ambitious, and dedicated volunteers can be. Equally, volunteers with disabilities have a lot to offer. Therefore, we urge our partners in the United Nations system and beyond to engage persons with disabilities in advancing peace and sustainable development through volunteerism.
Thank you so much for those wonderful opening remarks. And I think it really highlights that we need to create an intentional ecosystem of partners to create the change around disability inclusion, with persons with disability at the center of it. Those were our opening remarks. We're now moving into the segment where we're going to hear from our United Nations partners and then some of the lived experiences of persons with disability in the workplace. And I'm now going to hand over first to Gopal Mitra, the Senior Social Affairs Officer from the Executive Office of the Secretary General. And he's going to provide an overview of our United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy and the goals for today. Gopal, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be participating at the event today. The very nature of this event, which brings together so many different parts of the United Nations, staff with disabilities, the private sector partners, is a testimony to the coming together to address disability inclusion in a coordinated manner by the United Nations. I have been in this event for the last 8-10 years, and this is the first time we have seen such a level of coordination to avoid, as we say, duplicacy, not reinventing the wheel, and so on, that we keep saying. But seriously, this is the first time that the whole system has coordinated in such a nice manner to produce something which actually will make a difference. Let me take a few minutes to tell you a few things about the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. The strategy was launched by the Secretary General 3.5 years back to make the UN system fit for purpose on disability inclusion. For the first time, the UN system had a common, comprehensive framework to systematically advance disability inclusion. And the operative words are common, comprehensive, and systematic. 5 years back, if you would ask me, how is the UN doing on disability inclusion, I would have told you, oh, we are doing this project here, we are undertaking this initiative here. But for the first time, there is actually a baseline from which we can measure progress. The strategy has a very concrete accountability framework with specific indicators and benchmarks. It has a broad scope, covers all the 3 pillars of the UN's work: human rights, peace and security, development. Covers headquarters, entities, that means, as well as country teams. It covers both programs and internal operations, and that is why the discussion here is so important in terms of seeing it from the perspective of implementation of the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy. Subsequent to the launch of the strategy, UN entities and country teams have been implementing and reporting on the strategy. The strategy has concrete benchmarks on employment of persons with disabilities. But we also know that to enhance employment, as was so eloquently mentioned, we need an ecosystem of partners. We also need an ecosystem approach, ecosystem on simultaneous actions on different fronts, enhancing physical and digital accessibility. If our offices are not accessible, you can't have people with disabilities come into our offices and work. Digital accessibility. If our web portals, digital infrastructure is not accessible, you can't expect persons with disabilities to come and work on an equal basis with others. We need provisioning of reasonable accommodation. And most of all, a shift in mindsets. The strategy has concrete benchmarks on accessibility, on reasonable accommodation, on raising knowledge and capacity. And for the last 3 years of implementation, we have seen that clear progress has been made. Let me highlight a couple of nuances in that. Back in 2019, when the strategy was launched, at the end of that year's implementation, only 16% of the strategy's benchmarks were being met by the UN system. 16%, 1.6 out of 10. At the end of 2021, it has risen to 30%. So it's definitely a progress. There is 100% progress from 16% to 30%. But it is also true that we are yet to achieve 70%. And for the first time, we know that we have to go there. What is encouraging is that over the last 3 years, as part of the implementation, there are a multitude of good practices, and I'm deliberately not saying best practices, good practices at least, that have emerged across programs and operations. We have seen many examples where human resources policies and practices have been revised, updated to be more disability inclusive. We have seen strengthening provisioning of reasonable accommodation, examples of it. We have seen many examples of enhancement of physical and digital accessibility and actions where even in conflict and difficult situations, capacity building of knowledge and awareness is happening. And it is but important that these practices are shared, are understood, are so that we can draw and build upon those. The implementation of the strategy has also revealed areas which require system-wide action if we want to enhance employment of persons with disabilities. And that is why the event today is so important in terms of exchange of knowledge, acknowledging and discussing challenges, as well as finding common solutions. Let me end by saying that we still have 70% of the way to go, and we cannot lose our focus on disability inclusion. We have seen that during times of crisis, during times of difficult times, disability inclusion often goes to the back burner. We will stand then to reverse the hard-earned gains that we have made. And as a community, as partners, we have to keep our eye on the ball and maintain that focus and that momentum. And the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy will continue to provide that common space to doing so. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gopal, for sharing the common framework that we have that actually helps us create the baseline and to now progress and move forward. And thank you also for the incredible work you've been doing in this space to progress things forward. I'm now going to hand over to my partner with purpose that sits all the way at the other end, Jim Sinocki. He's mentioned to me his name. You can say Sinocki. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Jim.
Perfect. You learn very fast, obviously.
Over to you for the next segment of the session.
Thank you very much. I want to say before I get into my remarks, and don't wince because I'm going to eat up just a little bit of time, that during the last few weeks as I've been talking with the UN colleagues and setting up this event, I was impressed by the progress the UN has made since I not just left JP Morgan Chase, but during my 5.5 years at Chase, how far the UN is going forward with their policies and practices. I was just overwhelmed by the attitude, the structure, and the, how should I say, the perseverance of getting disability inclusion on the right track worldwide. So before I begin, you know, an applause for the UN for doing this. I just think it's amazing what you guys have done so far. This session is near and dear to my heart. Several years ago, when I was head of disability inclusion at JP Morgan Chase, I had the pleasure of hosting Assistant Secretary General for Human Resources, Martha Helena Lopez, and several UN staffers at my Park Avenue office. We had just embarked on our disability inclusion journey, and it was my pleasure to share best practices. In essence, what worked and what didn't work from our perspectives at the bank. Now here we are again, and I'm just as excited as you are in the audience to hear about progress being made by the United Nations Development Program, the United Nations Children Emergency Fund, and the United Nations Secretariat. Before we start, I'd like to say I'm a Caucasian man with brown hair, glasses, and I'm seated in a power wheelchair. I'm basically a quadriplegic, a guy that shouldn't be working or doing what I'm doing now. I guess I broke all the rules of being disabled, and I hope we all do that going forward. So before we begin, we're going to hear from the United Nations Development Program, the United Nations Children's Emergency Fund, and the United Nations Secretariat. I think I got all of that right. Yes. I did? Yes. Thank you very much. So could each of you start by introducing yourself, starting with a visual description, and tell us what you do with your respective UN organization. So I guess Irina?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, my name is Irina Stavenskaya. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Human Resources of the United Nations Development Program. A few words about myself. I'm a Caucasian woman. I'm from the Republic of Moldova. I'm blonde, and I'm wearing a red dress today. I guess for me, the Christmas holidays have started a little bit already. I'm super happy to be here today and share with you some information about the work that UNDP is doing on the inclusion of persons with disabilities. This is something that is a big priority for us. And I'm very happy to say that we've been championing inclusion of persons with disabilities for many years. While inclusion of persons with disabilities has always been part of our diversity and inclusion strategy, back in 2017, we decided that a more concerted, purposeful effort is needed for us to achieve more progress in this area. And this is when we developed our first strategy for the inclusion of persons with disabilities in our workforce. And that strategy at the time had 5 pillars. The first one was ensuring that all our internal policies, strategies, procedures, and guidance facilitated and promoted the inclusion of persons with disabilities. There were quite a few changes that needed to be made, and we've successfully completed most of them by now. The second pillar of our strategy was increasing awareness about work with persons with disabilities and specific challenges that they face in the workplace. So raising that awareness among our managers, among staff was our priority, and a lot of activities were organized since then in this area. The third pillar was making sure that we purposefully create opportunities for persons with disabilities to join UNDP, and quite a few different initiatives were organized in that space. But creating opportunities was not enough. We deliberately decided to make sure that when colleagues join UNDP, they can, just like everybody else, produce good work, contribute to our mission, and feel the sense of belonging in our offices. And the fifth pillar of our strategy was collecting more information. What we discovered when we started is that we did not have enough data to go by, and we really needed to develop that database that would allow us to address challenges that persons with disabilities in the UNDP workspace faced very meaningfully. So when in 2019 the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy was adopted, we discovered that a lot of the same issues were emphasized, but also there were some new elements that we aligned ourselves to, and since that time we've been operating under the umbrella of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. I would like to use this opportunity to share with you a couple of more concrete things that we've done since 2017 and since 2019 when the UN strategy was adopted. And also I'm looking forward to the discussion to follow for us to see what our colleagues in other organizations have done so that we could learn from that. Let me start with leadership. Obviously, we realize that strong senior leadership is absolutely fundamental to achieve success in this area, and that's exactly why our administrator, members of the executive group of UNDP, have been consistently and continuously communicating about the need for inclusion. And they've been doing that through messages to staff, communications, statements in different events, and also for providing concrete support to the initiatives that we've been organizing. That has been very valuable and allowed us to move far. Also, our key strategies, our strategic plan has a very explicit mention of our priority with regards to inclusion of persons with disabilities, and that is a very explicit key focus area in our People for 2030 strategy as well. This is our flagship people management strategy. Moving on to employment. Our flagship initiative in this area is something that we've been working on very closely with our partner agency, United Nations Volunteers, and that is the talent program for young professionals with disabilities. We launched it in 2017, and there were two objectives that we wanted to achieve. One was to increase the number of persons with disabilities working in UNDP and in other organizations who collaborated with us, and also to build a pipeline of qualified talent with disabilities that could then advance development agenda in their respective countries at the national and global levels. As of today, as of November 2022, more than 50 young professionals with disabilities have been hired and operate and work in our country, regional, and headquarters offices very successfully. But I should say that this is not the only initiative in this area. All our jobs are explicitly open for persons with disabilities. We encourage them to apply for our positions, and we try to make sure that we proactively outreach to them and invite them to participate. Every year we participate in a number of different career fairs with some of them target persons with disabilities, and we inform them in quite a bit of a detail of what our expectations are, what the priorities are, and how they can apply for positions in UNDP. Those have been quite successful. We also have a couple of dedicated talent programs. One is the Junior Professional Officers program, and the other one is the newly launched graduate program, which targets candidates from our program countries, and those are, again, explicitly encouraging persons with disabilities to apply. So that's on employment. As I mentioned earlier, it's not enough to hire persons with disabilities and bring them into the organization. As Gopal was also mentioning, it's absolutely critical to make sure that when they join our organization, UNDP, they can work effectively and contribute to the achievement of our objectives. And there are three priority areas in this sense that we're focusing on. One is obviously accessibility, and there are two key focus areas within that space. One is the accessibility of our premises. We have established minimum accessibility criteria that all our offices are expected to meet, and we have a fund corporate fund that country offices can apply for if they need some capital investment funding to invest into the accessibility of buildings and facilities. We also invested quite a bit into the accessibility of information. It's absolutely critical for anyone joining UNDP to be effective in their work. I'm very happy to report that as of now, 100% of our corporate platforms are accessible. They use accessible technologies. Our web presence is also accessible, and we hope that that increases opportunities for persons with disabilities to work with us and join UNDP in our workforce. The other area for us was reasonable accommodation, of course. So we've created a corporate fund that we can use across our offices to cover, to accommodate the needs, the special needs of individuals working for us. And that ranges from facilitating their access to information, purchasing assistive technologies, assistive equipment, and so on. So that is a measure that turned out to be quite successful, and we will continue implementing it going forward. And the third focus area for us in this space is capacity building and building the inclusive culture inside the organization. Lots of activities have been organized in this space, and we are hoping that they're all delivering good, tangible results. Just to name a few, we've launched to make sure that all our colleagues are aware about the work with persons with disabilities and some of the challenges that these colleagues face in our workspace. We launched a new online course, Disability Inclusion, Building an Inclusive and Accessible United Nations. We worked on that course together with other UN agencies, and we launched it several years ago as an essential course that's mandatory for some and very strongly recommended for other staff members working for us. We've recently created also a new disability inclusion network that brings together focal points for disability inclusion from all our offices. This is the space that we've deliberately created for people from different offices working on disability inclusion to have an opportunity to come together from time to time, share ideas, discuss challenges that they still face, and also jointly come up with solutions. This is in addition to a less formal network that we've created for peer support, where colleagues with disabilities, but also others working with them, can come together and share ideas and thoughts. This is all in addition to the work that we do on culture, and that one is part of our broader agenda on disability, equity, and inclusion. So this brings me to the end of my remarks. I wanted to once again thank you for the opportunity to be here, to share with you some of our progress, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later in this meeting to see what we can learn from others and how we can further accelerate the efforts that we implement in UNDP. Thank you so much.
So believe it or not, we're already short on time. So I want to still try to get to the next two, and let's see how we go. So United Nations Children's Emergency Fund, Banjugo, I hope I have gotten that half right. Will you start, please?
Thank you, Jim. My name is Banjugo Magassa. I'm from Côte d'Ivoire, black, African, tall, wearing gray suit and a gray white tie. It's really an honor to be for me to be with you today, Excellencies, distinguished delegates and partners, and our dear guests, with my dear colleague Gita, my favorite partner in UNICEF. To be with you today and share with you the progress that we've made as an organization in implementing the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy, but also the challenges that we've faced and how we are working to address those challenges in order to make UNICEF, the United Nations Children Fund, a truly diverse and inclusive organization. At UNICEF, we are strongly committed to diversity and clearly understand that as an organization, we need our workforce to be diverse and our organizational culture and workplace to be truly inclusive and respectful of diversity. If we were at UNICEF to achieve our goals of inclusive programs, enabling us to reach the full diversity of the children that we serve across the globe, and to be inclusive of every child. UNICEF's first ever disability inclusion policy and strategy was recently endorsed by our global management team in September, and we are planning to launch it very soon, hopefully during the next couple of weeks. The strategy outlines a very clear direction for UNICEF to become a fully disability inclusive organization, and it sets clear targets for the employment of persons with disabilities. With UNICEF's ambitious goal to achieve inclusive employment and advance in this area, we've had to address, as I said earlier, several challenges which we continue to work on, especially the lack of institutionalization of disability inclusion within UNICEF employment policies and the limited capacity and awareness amongst human resources practitioners, leaders, and managers on how to include employees with disability so that they can carry out their job on an equal basis with others. In response to these challenges, we've introduced several measures. First, we've implemented a policy on disability inclusive human resources management, which highlights new provisions for the attraction, recruitment, retention, and development of employees with disability. And during our recruitment processes, and as per our policies, we make sure that all candidates with disabilities who meet the minimum requirement of the job they apply for are in the shortlist and carried forward for the next step of the recruitment processes. While applying for posts, candidates with disability can voluntarily disclose the disability and request reasonable accommodations to not only participate in the selection process, but also, when selected, perform their function on an equal basis as others. We've actively engaged with the UNV program to bring in and build a pipeline of professionals with disability, and UNICEF is currently employing 24 UN volunteers with disabilities who are working in different parts of the organizations, at headquarters, in regional offices, and our country offices. We've also have two vibrant employee resource groups. Disability Connect is one, which is our global network of employees with disability, and the support group for employees with children with disability, because we want to go beyond our staff and also support them when they are not themselves with disabilities, but they do have children with disabilities. So both groups offer peer support and advocate to the rest of the organization, enabling us to be better informed of employees' experiences as well as barriers to a more inclusive workplace, which help us to refine our policies and our actions. So while we have taken several concrete steps to become a more inclusive organization, there is still a lot to be done. And I now hand over to my dear favorite colleague, Gita, who is heading our culture and diversity team in the office of our executive director, and we've positioned this team in the office of the executive director to really emphasize the strategic dimension that we apply to that, to diversity and inclusion. So Geeta will share with us the details of how we're creating an enabling environment for every employees with disabilities, what we're doing and what we need to do more, and how we're progressing on implementing the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. Thank you very much. Geeta, over to you.
Thank you so much, Magasa, and thank you, Jim. Hello, colleagues. It's really an honor to be here. My name is Geeta Narayan. I have black curly hair, I wear glasses, I have brown skin, and I'm wearing a black jacket today. First, let me start with the good news in terms of how UNICEF is doing with respect to disability inclusion. So the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy has really enabled UNICEF to systematize disability inclusion within all aspects of our programs and our operations. As of 2021, we are actually meeting 75% of the strategy's benchmarks. In 2019, just 3 years ago, we were meeting just over 40% of the indicators. So we feel quite proud of the progress we've made, but we're not there yet. Still, in terms of progress, as of 2021, 148 UNICEF country offices are working on disability inclusive programs, reaching over 4.8 million children with disabilities across development and humanitarian contexts. This is compared to 2.2 million children with disabilities that we reached in 2020. Also in 2021, $245 million of our expenditure supported children with disabilities. Having trained personnel on disability inclusion, such as technical advisors on disability inclusion in most of our regional offices and at headquarters level, as well as having employees with disabilities, are some of the factors that have enabled us to deliver better for children. Two other developments that we are very proud of. In January 2023, we will be launching a digital and physical accessibility help desks to provide on-demand support and train and build the capacity of our staff on accessibility of our infrastructure, platforms, and products to increase the level of accessibility of our offices overall. UNICEF has a Greening and Accessibility Fund, which is financed through a 3% surcharge on all of our air travel. This supports our offices to become greener and more accessible. Presently, about half, 52% of our offices report meeting at least the minimum level of accessibility. Secondly, as Magasa has mentioned, we have a reasonable accommodation fund, which is centrally resourced, making it possible for any applicant or any employee with a disability to apply for reasonable accommodation through an online portal. The fund was scaled up from $50,000 to $300,000 in 2020 to meet the requirements of employees with disabilities as well as candidates with disabilities. We are now undertaking an independent evaluation of the Reasonable Accommodation Fund so that we can understand better what has worked well and less well and scale up the model to meet the ambition that our new disability inclusion strategy sets out in line with the CRPD. Now on to where we need to do better. We are not quite meeting all of the requirements when it comes to the UNDIS indicator on employment and capacity building. To meet the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy requirements on employment, employees with disabilities must report the same level of satisfaction in working with UNICEF as employees without disabilities. Our 2020 staff survey showed that there is a difference of 7 percentage points between employees with disabilities and employees without disabilities when they are asked if they would recommend UNICEF as a good place to work. This shows us that we need to do more to create an enabling and inclusive environment to help employees with disabilities feel a sense of belonging so that we can both attract and retain them and help them to deliver for children. Our work on disability inclusion needs to be seen also within the overall context of what else is happening in the organization. Over the past few years, UNICEF has been on a journey to create an inclusive and enabling workplace culture where our core values are respected and practiced by each UNICEF employee in service to our mandate for children's rights. Our culture change work goes hand in hand with our work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So therefore, we are taking a whole of diversity approach, which recognizes that our employees are nuanced individuals with multiple, concurrent, or intersectional identities. For many employees, the multiplicity of these identities often interact to create compounded forms of discrimination or create barriers to their full participation. So this requires us to adopt an approach to workforce diversity that is intersectional, one that welcomes and sees employees in their full diversity and helps to create an enabling workplace. To strengthen the capacity of HR personnel and hiring managers, we have developed a guide on diversity, equity, and inclusion in recruitment, and a guide on disability-inclusive employment. Both of these guides are designed to look at diversity from the earliest stages of any recruitment and to build in consideration of multiple aspects of diversity, including disabilities. We've heard from our workforce that they're not sure what different terms mean when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're nervous about what words to use and what words not to use. So we have developed a DEI glossary because we are all learning how to be more inclusive and how to be allies. We have shared this glossary within the UN system through the High-Level Committee on Management Working Group on DEI. But words are just a starting point. We need to still do more to identify and reduce stigma, to build awareness of our staff, our HR colleagues, managers, and senior leaders on disability inclusion. And we need to do more to change mindsets and behaviors to be more grounded in our core values, to be more respectful and inclusive. Let me end on a note of optimism. We have certainly made good progress at UNICEF, but we are still very much on a learning journey when it comes to disability inclusion and diversity, equity, and inclusion overall. We therefore look forward to learn more from other UN entities and from the private sector and from all of you here today so that we can make even more progress together. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You guys are very impressive. It's just wonderful to hear. I know we're running slow on time, so I'm trying to keep this thing moving. United Nations Secretariat, Miguel Gordo.
Thank you, Jim, and good afternoon. My name is Miguel Morato Gordo. I'm a male coming from Portugal. I have sort of salt and pepper hair, almost fully white beard, and I'll say middle-aged young. And I'm wearing a big black frames and sort of light brown jacket. So, Excellencies, partners, dear colleagues, dear participants, I have the honor to say a few words about the road that the UN Secretariat is traveling in this space of improving and creating, removing barriers for persons with disabilities to really be able to bring their whole selves and contribute on an equal basis like any other staff in the Secretariat. This is really a multi-staker process and partnership. So what you will hear is a bit on the Secretariat, but in fact, it's a collective contribution from many different colleagues. There was a presentation that was shared, I think, in a hard copy, so if those want to follow, but I will be making a few remarks. Let me start by referring to two quotes, one from the Secretary General, reaffirming his commitment and wanting to see the United Nations to be an employer of choice for persons with disabilities, and a quote from a colleague, Mahjoub Bulhaj, who has been a staff member since 2000 in the Secretariat, and on being asked how can the UN become an employer of choice, and his words were, by making persons with disabilities visible and proving that they can be fully productive if given the proper training and education. So the principles of equality, inclusion, and non-discrimination are foundational values of the United Nations. As a critical part of our human resources strategy, the Secretariat aspires to build a workforce that reflects the diversity of the peoples we serve. The organization has long committed to the employment of persons with disabilities with standards and guidance provided through the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the policy on the employment of persons with disabilities. Driven by the 2030 Agenda and our promise to leave no one behind, the UN launched a Disability Inclusion Strategy in 2019 as part of the SDGs reform initiatives. The strategy aims to position the UN as a leader in disability inclusion. The strategy provides further impetus for mainstreaming disability inclusion into all areas of our work. Disability inclusion strategy has a set of core areas and 15 indicators. Our discussion will focus just on 2 of those core areas, inclusiveness and organizational culture, and 4 indicators, accessibility, employment, reasonable accommodation, and capacity development. We believe that advancing these areas will put us on the path to becoming an employer of choice. For the core area of inclusiveness, our focus has been on identifying and removing barriers to inclusion by addressing gaps in reasonable accommodation and digital and physical accessibility. For organizational culture, our goal is to improve workplace culture by addressing discrimination, bias, stigma, and other barriers to inclusion throughout the employment life cycle. We want to highlight a few areas as to where we are on some of the indicators. And for those who have the presentation that was shared, this is on slide 6, and you'll see that, referring to our 2021 report, there's mixed results across these 4 indicators and across the UN Secretariat as a whole. So we acknowledge that a lot more work is needed, and we want to see more entities within the Secretariat meeting and exceeding expectations on all 4 indicators. So what does this mean in concrete terms? For instance, to meet the requirement on employment, a policy and strategy should be in place with provisions for attracting, retaining, and promoting the career development of persons with disabilities. In addition, the levels of satisfaction and well-being of staff members with disabilities should be the same as that of other staff population. As of now, overall, the organization is yet to meet these requirements. We want to highlight some of the important work that's already been done. Number 1, to support our mainstreaming efforts in 2020, we have established a focal point network comprising senior officers of different entities across the globe. The focal points advance the disability including agenda at the entity level and throughout the organization. Secondly, there's a lot of evidence that employee resources or affinity groups are very impactful for advancing workplace inclusion. Thus far, 3 disability employee resource groups have been launched across the organization. The Office of Human Resources will regularly engage with these employment resource groups to seek their feedback and input on critical HR issues. Thirdly, recognizing how critical accommodation is to inclusion, in 2021, we reviewed the end-to-end process for reasonable accommodation to streamline the process and make it more efficient. Some of the findings have been documented as guidelines. Fourthly, we cannot change what we don't measure, so we're also trying to make improvements in terms of availability of data, which we believe continues to be critical for designing programs and measuring impact. And as of August this year, we've launched a confidential self-identification survey in our recruitment platform to obtain more data, which will inform our programs and advance our recruitment objectives. Also, to address accessibility, a multi-year accessibility implementation was developed based on a 2018 facility review, and the implementation is ongoing. In terms of sourcing and outreach to applicants, we have been more intentional in our efforts through partnerships with organizations of persons with disabilities and specialized job boards. And to build capacity of the workforce in 2020, a disability inclusion online training course was launched, which is a result of collaborative efforts with UNDP. Other capacity building efforts have been geared towards addressing bias, discrimination, and stigma, including the United to Respect dialogues, values and behaviors leadership dialogues, which have been rolled out globally across the Secretariat. As part of efforts to build an inclusive and enabling environment, a workplace mental health and well-being strategy was launched in 2021. And to strengthen communication and raise awareness, we have developed various tools and guidelines. Also, specific senior-level mechanisms are in place for ensuring accountability for disability inclusion and other inclusion priorities through our People Management Index and Senior Managers Compact. Just a word on challenges. Challenges remain in several areas. Based on data from our staff survey, only 516 staff members identified as persons with disabilities. We believe this is a low number that could be the result of low hiring rate or a culture that has not been able to encourage yet as much self-disclosure as we would like to see. The same survey also shows a lower rate of satisfaction and well-being for staff members with disabilities than the general population or staff population. Accessibility remains an issue at both headquarters and field offices, and we still do not have a comprehensive data on the number of persons with disabilities in our workforce. Finally, implementation on the disability employment strategy has been slow. To see change, we want to challenge the way we have been doing and this work and have identified several priorities for the future. We'll be conducting an audit of our human resources policies and processes from a disability lens to identify barriers to equal participation. We aim to develop an action plan to address barriers as they will be identified. We will complete our HQ headquarters building accessibility implementation plan, which was delayed due to the pandemic. The completion is now scheduled for 2023. Early next year, also we'll plan to roll out a series of workshops focused on inclusive leadership and reasonable accommodation. We recognize the critical role of data in identifying gaps and measuring progress, and we're planning to launch a robust and confidential data collection mechanism for our personnel. Inclusive employment requires intentionality, therefore, we want to make every effort to embed inclusive practices throughout the employment life cycle. We also believe that targeted programs are impactful for accelerating progress on disability employment. So we will close knowledge gaps by creating also a knowledge hub to provide easily accessible information on disabilities for hiring managers, supervisors, and personnel across the organization. And we will strengthen and leverage existing partnerships and build new ones with UN agencies, funds, and programs, and organizations of persons with disabilities. So let me move on to my last two points, one on targets and commitments. So as you heard, we have laid out some of the targets and commitments for the next few years. We are working to achieve the target of meets in the indicator of employment, which is still a challenge for us. This means we need to identify efforts to diversify the workforce. It also means that we need to better support our personnel with disabilities so that by the next engagement survey, we'll see improvements in their satisfaction scores in the way they're experiencing the organization. So lastly, we recognize the leadership role that the United Nations has. We know all eyes are on us in the area of disability employment. We do want to lead by example and commit to building safe, inclusive, and equitable workplaces where persons with disabilities can thrive and lead fulfilling careers. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. I love the structure, and I think that even at Chase and at IBM, we had to build, the blocks to get where we have to go. It just doesn't happen overnight. So I think you guys are on the right track. We're a little bit behind on time, Jenny. So we'll go to the next one.
That's okay, Jim. We'll make up for that.
All right, good.
We'll now do a little bit of a reshuffle. So thank you so much to all the UN partners here on stage. A big thank you again for sharing the progress made, the gaps and the challenges ahead. I think this was really a segment to hold us accountable as well as UN, where we are and where we want to go. Yes, you can move off. And we're now moving into a segment where we really want to listen and learn from also the lived experiences of persons with disability in the workforce. So we'd love to invite our featured speakers up on stage for that part. And thank you for your patience. We're going to delay the break a little bit, but we think this is a really important part to have before we break. No, over to Jim. I think Jim will do a quick...
All right. No, thank you for speeding up here, everybody. Glad to have you. This section is called Let's Talk About It with UN Employees with Disabilities. I'm especially excited about this session. It's all about relaying stories based on personal experiences of UN personnel with disabilities and their experience they've had in the workplace. I'd like each speaker to briefly introduce themselves when I call on them and provide a visual description. So let's start with Danielle Bass from the UN Disabilities Network or Employee Resource Group.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am Caucasian, short hair, brownish, dyed. I'm wearing a white jacket and a foulard. Thank you for the introduction. I'm wearing many hats today, actually. I'm the director of the Division for Inclusive Social Development at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And through the division I lead for DASA, we are the focal point globally on disability, among other things. The other hat I'm wearing is the hat of a staff member who happens also to be a woman. So sometimes there are quite a few challenges to be faced, both because of the gender and because of the disability. And I also have the honor and very proud to be presently the president of the self-help group composed by UN staff and the delegates of permanent missions who have either a disability or have a family member with a disability. And we circulated as UN Disabilities, capital letters, and the dis is very small in between brackets. Because our aim is to bring to the United Nations, as we are already doing, but make it visible to the United Nations, all the skills and the abilities that we have as professionals. And we're very proud of having circulated a survey we prepared with the support, however, of the staff union. We circulated it globally in 2018, 1 year before the UNDIS, the United Nations Disability Inclusive, was launched, asking questions to colleagues. And we received more than 2,000 replies globally, where people identified themselves as either having a disability, what kind of disability, or having a family member with a disability. So we're very proud of this self-help group called UN Disabilities. But as I said, I'm wearing many hats. But before I share with you a couple of things related to challenges and also to achievements from my perspective as a staff member. I would like to ask all of you to raise your hand if you can, and if you are wearing either glasses or if you are wearing contact lenses. Thank you. And now my other question is, and this is a very confidential private matter, so you can or not raise your hand. How many of you have a disability? Thank you. Again, raise your hands, those who are wearing contact glasses or contact lenses or glasses. Thank you. So there are more people who do not identify themselves as having a disability, even though they are wearing glasses. Isn't that interesting? Wearing glasses is a technical aid, assistive aid that we are using when our eyes are not seeing properly as before, when our eyes have a disability. So I think that what we are aiming to do at the United Nations is to make sure that whatever glasses, wheelchairs, hearing aids, cognitive disabilities, etc. we have, they're not going to be noticed, as we're not noticing any longer people wearing glasses. They themselves do not acknowledge themselves as having a disability. And this is the mental change that we want to see at the United Nations. And I'm very proud and glad to see how many important people this morning as well spoke at the event we, as DESA, launched to promote this and celebrate this International Day of Persons with Disabilities that was entitled Transformative Solutions for Inclusive Development, the Role of Innovation in Fueling an Accessible and Equitable World. And we focused on SDG 8, employment, and SDG 10, inequalities, so how employment can help also to reduce inequalities. And we chose as a specific area of interest a sector, sport, because in sport we really employ people in so many different areas, from tech to fashion to tourism and travel and so on. So that is our contribution to the event of this afternoon. And yes, Gopal said this morning, or earlier on, that the UN has been working together this time for the very first time. And I think it is true. We have, as DESA, been working very closely with the Office of Human Resources, for instance, to make sure that in the morning we were focusing more on the private and the public sector together with persons with disabilities, and in the afternoon, engaging more with the UN system. And this is the way we should be working together. And I'm very proud of this success. Now, I joined the United Nations in 1986 when I was as a JPO. And talking about good practices, in those years, I had to wait for a few months before being hired or before moving to Vienna, to the UN in Vienna, because there were no accessible toilets. So thanks to me, the UN had its first toilet accessible to persons with a disability. And that goes back 35 years ago or something like that. And so that's a huge achievement, I think, and that's an example of good practices. Yes, slow, but yet it happens. Then I left the United Nations for about 18 years. I've done other things in my life, from being a journalist to many other interesting things. And then back to the United Nations in 2011 as a director, from JPO to director. Nice. This gives me the position to influence a teeny bit more with my traveling around, for instance. I raise awareness without talking, by acting, by being seen, by demonstrating, if I ever needed to demonstrate. I used to when I was younger. Now, when you get older, you need to demonstrate less. You know who you are. A person with a disability or a woman with a disability has the same abilities as others. And we do not have the same abilities in any case. This is why the world is beautiful. We're different. One can be skilled in drawing, the other one in singing, the other one in doing craft work, for instance, okay? And I'm very proud of the fact that in 2014, the former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon published the first bulletin about accessibility and making the environment of the United Nations a welcoming environment. And then, with the present Secretary General, we have UNDIS. But member states decided to have CRPD many years ago, and that's amazing. And in 2015, member states decided to give a roadmap, the 2030 Agenda, with its 17 SDGs, to leave no one behind and no country behind. So let's focus not only today, but in the next coming months on SDG 8 and 10. Let's bring our knowledge and our voices to the Commission for Social Development next February that has as a policy theme employment as a way to reduce inequalities and as a way also of building forward because of the pandemic. And let's keep in mind that between the 9th and the 10th of September next year, we have the SDG Summit. So let's utilize this space today to keep building, not only celebrating. And I stop here. I would have so much to share with you, but I just wanted to give you some energy to keep thinking of what actions we can take together to have more persons employed with disabilities in the UN family. And of course, we have to keep in mind, as I said, also the outcomes of the various surveys, also the one we had that focused a lot about career and accommodation. And when it comes to accommodation and accessibility, it also includes to make sure that staff members with a disability have the same benefits that staff members with a family member with a disability have. Staff members with a disability do not have the same benefits. And I wonder why. The disability is the same, the needs are the same, and if we think of reasonable accommodation, it should be applied also when, for instance, traveling on mission. Sometimes there might be the need to have a personal assistant and or rental subsidy. If you are hired as a G4 or a P2 or a P3 or P4, even P5, even D2, if reasonable accommodation is not provided, and in terms also of rental subsidy, I did not get the rental subsidy, for instance, because I'm not married and I have no children, but I need a bigger apartment to move around. And you can imagine how expensive this is in Manhattan. So if I have challenges, how can a G4, G5, P2, 3, 4, whatever, make it? It's difficult. So these are some of the challenges we have to think of. But as I said, there are many successes, including the fact that we have described ourselves today to those who are visually impaired. We started doing this morning, and the Office of the Human Resources has carried it on in the afternoon. And when the Office of the Human Resources does that, this is a strong sign. Very, very important. And I also want to thank those of you, few, who are wearing masks that are transparent so that people who are hearing impaired can read by looking and reading your lips. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniela. Now I'll go with Sabella Martinez from the UN Department for General Assembly and Conference Management. You can applaud now. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here today to talk to you. And yes, my name is Isabel Avion, and I have a confession to make today. And the confession is, I'm a cyborg. Yes, I'm a cyborg. And why? Well, that's what my 11-year-old stepson calls me, and who am I to disagree with him, right? So over the past few weeks, and I'll get to the physical description with this, I had 3 surgeries. 2 of them involved drilling 2 holes in my skull, hence the haircut. I wear very, very short hair. And to implant 2 electrodes. These electrodes go to a region of my brain. And then the third surgery was implanting a battery on my chest around here. And this is called deep brain stimulation, or DBS, for those of you in the know. And it's advanced therapy, or second-line therapy for Parkinson's disease. As you probably know, Parkinson's disease is a progressive, neurological, degenerative condition. There's no cure. So I control my symptoms the best I can, which is why I had this surgery. And now, because I'm a little bit nervous talking to all of you here today, you don't know if I'm shaking because of Parkinson's, right? Or because of nerves. So I'll take it. I'm able to continue to work in DGACM under our Mrs. Chalet because of medication and because of the incredible support that I get from my colleagues. Some of them are here today. So my fellow speakers and I face a challenge today. And it's how we can convince you of the importance of hiring people like us. And just last week, I was in a training organized by OHR on disability. And we were asked this: why should we hire people with disabilities? And there were many answers. I copied some of them. And one of them was because no one can be left behind, because everyone matters. There's precious skill, humanity, love, and capacity in people who are not standard. There were quotation marks. So it looks like we've done it, right? If people say that this is why you have to hire us, I guess we've done it, but the problem is that, no, we haven't. So what happens? So we have the strategy, which is great. We're implementing it, which is great. But we've heard this already. There was a survey done, the Secretariat-wide survey in 2021. 2.9% of the people, 516, I think Miguel said, self-identify as persons with disabilities. 2.9%, 516. Now, fun fact number 1, around 15% of the world's population, or 1 billion with a B, people, live with disabilities. Remember 2.9, 15? Fun fact number 2, and you got a little bit of a preview of this thanks to Daniela. In the survey, and also on the employment, the hiring system at the UN, the question is, do you consider yourself to have a disability? Imagine what the answer would be if instead of that, there were the following. Do you have difficulty seeing, even if wearing glasses? Do you have difficulty hearing, even if using a hearing aid? Do you have difficulty walking or climbing steps? Do you have difficulty remembering or concentrating? Do you have difficulty with self-care, such as washing all over or dressing? Or using your usual language? Do you have difficulty communicating? For example, understanding or being understood. And the answers you would have, the options would be no, no difficulty, yes, some difficulty, yes, a lot of difficulty, or cannot do at all. I wish I could take credit for this set of questions, but they are not mine. They are from the group of Washington, and we cannot encourage enough all entities across the board to please start using these questions instead of do you consider yourself a person with a disability? And what else can I tell you? There's a sentence, there's a huge paragraph when you apply for a job at the UN. And it says that we want to hire people, as we were saying, with different backgrounds, gender, and all of that. And there's a sentence at the end that says, reasonable accommodation for applicants with disabilities may be provided to support participation in the recruitment process when requested and indicated in the application. I say often because sadly, it's not always there. Just last week, it wasn't there for a D1, a G6, a P3, a G5, and more at headquarters, other duty stations, and the field. And yes, I did check some of them. And it used to be, I had here another note, indicated in the application. Well, good luck with that because there's no indication. So you would have to sacrifice part of the 2,000 characters of your motivational statement. But now there is a sentence, there is the question. However, if you've been applying for jobs at the UN for a while, like I have, you cannot, and you would have to start from scratch to reply to that question. And yeah, I checked. I was applying last week for a job. So what can I say? Then being a cyborg doesn't really give me mind-reading powers. I don't have a 5G connection or a Wi-Fi connection thanks to this device that I'm wearing. I do set off metal detectors. I cannot go through them anymore. But if anything, what it does give me, and I think it's clear here today, is the energy, the strength to ask this question over and over again. The question of where are we, the people with disabilities? Where are we at the UN? Where are we in the UN system? And until we get reliable data, of course, that'll help us truly achieve inclusion. Thank you very much.
Brava.
Thank you, Sabella. I think if I may comment on that, my view as a C5, C6 quadriplegic is that you're qualified to work here. It's not your disability, it's you. And I think that we shouldn't punish ourselves for who we are or how we look, but it's a fight to stay in the game when, you know, people are against you. I've had that most of my life. But I'm a father of 2 children. I've got 2 grandchildren. I've got a 30-plus-year-old son. And I'm a father. I'm not a person with a disability to them. And so I think that your journey is hard, and we've just got to keep fighting that the way we know. I wouldn't back off on how we look or how people look at us. It's what we bring to the table. And you certainly bring something to the table. I think we're going to Mariko.
Hello. Thank you, Jim. Hi, everyone. My name is Mariko Tatsumi Fisian. I am legally blind. I'm from Japan. I have dark hair, dark long straight hair. I'm in a white suit. White suit, yes. Thank you very much for having me. Although I'm blind, I can see we have this big conference room, and I can feel the energy. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you very much. I'm also a working mom. I have 8-month-old baby. So 7 years ago, I came to New York from Japan. Not because to dream a fancy New York life, it's because the accessibility. I don't drive, so public transportation is very important for me. I started my career at the UN in 2018 as an intern at Office of Human Resources, which I'm currently working at as a JPO. I remember 4 years ago, before pandemic, we also had this conference for persons with disability, International Day, in a smaller conference room. And I still remember Jim was there. And then I didn't imagine myself speaking in this big room with bigger audience. And I'm so glad to see this big progress in this short term. So I joined at the UN as an intern by knowing UN is such a respectful organization. I never feel that I'm discriminated because of my disability. People are so generous, understanding. I feel the culture itself is welcoming. I never feel I don't get reasonable accommodation because of budget, but having a sense of belonging, inclusion, also finding myself as being valued, it would take a little while. Also need extra effort for that. So I rejoined the UN as a JPO for almost 2 years ago during pandemic. As it was said, technology is an enabler. Because of technology, I can read things on my screen, makes me easy to participate in meeting virtually. Also, I believe there are many trade-offs. For example, because I'm newly joined my current team, an online situation, it was challenging for me to build the relationship with my colleagues. It took time for me to share my background, understand each other. I believe things will be much easier if I work with people in person to let them know about me, introduce myself. People can see how I work, how I see, what kind of help I might need, so that people don't have to make any assumption and don't have to be have awkward situation, I would say. Although things are slowly back to in person, again, I'm so happy to be here today, talking in front of you, and looking forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, and we're glad to have you. Lastly, we have Sophia, is that right? Sophia, okay, thank you. From the U.S. Permanent Mission. Sophie will tell us her story, vocal disability challenges and successes, wheelchair rider, an article published on disability inclusion as well. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm Sofia Korach. I'm a Caucasian woman with long brown hair wearing a navy dress with flowers on it. And great to be on this panel as well. And I might take a little bit of a different approach as the one member state on the panel as well, and to talk about how my own personal experiences have also helped us advance what we do on the member state side on disability inclusion across the UN. And I think it's very fitting that this year's December 3rd theme is Transformative Solutions for Inclusive Development. As I see several of my third committee colleagues in the room as well, I wanted just to mention to those that might not follow UN negotiations, we had a huge success this year adopting the biannual resolution co-led by our colleagues from Philippines and Tanzania on disability inclusive development, which runs every other year in the third committee, which also had language for the first time ever as well on disability inclusion when it comes to women and girls and all persons with disabilities as decision makers and key leadership roles at all levels, especially in the context of climate change and disaster risk reduction. I also have to say, and colleagues in the room who were in that negotiation, that it also identified the challenges that we continue to face even 15 years after the CRPD, and even having challenges and making references to the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. So to my UN colleagues and my member state colleagues in the room, I really hope that we can continue working together on that. And the United States is a proud champion of the promoting and protecting the human rights of all persons with disabilities, and we're really proud to co-chair for the second year in a row together with Antigua and Barbuda, the Accessibility Steering Committee. You'll hear more about that from Ambassador Chris Liu at the closing session, but also wanted to note we'll be having our first meeting of the fall next week, so the invitation will be forthcoming. I wanted to bring the personal experience as well. So I am a woman with a disability, a wheelchair wheelchair user, but I'm our senior human rights advisor, and I cover disability rights, but I also cover a whole host of other issues related to human rights, and I'm also our lead at the Mission for Health. And so wanted just to give you a 30-second overview of what my day looks like and the challenges that I face as a delegate with a physical disability, and also some successes and accomplishments that we've had over the last several years, including through the Accessibility Steering Committee and also the GA revitalization process, which will be kicking off very shortly as well, and want to compliment our colleagues from Australia and El Salvador on that, where many colleagues have already indicated that accessibility will be a key priority coming out of that process, not just physical accessibility, but all types of accessibility. Our colleagues in the third committee who also have visual impairments and other types of disabilities face their own challenges on accessing the portals that we use every day, such as the e-delegate portal. So stepping back just to say, so as a delegate covering health and human rights, I'm expected to be all around the UN in a day-to-day at very short notice, covering for colleagues with no notice. And so usually I make my way through the delegates' entrance, and then I'm anywhere bouncing between the Security Council and the General Assembly, the ECOSOC chamber, the trusteeship chamber, and then in between going into all the various conference rooms, including the very tiny A, B, C, and D, which tend to be very full when we have negotiations, as we just finished the UN General Assembly Third Committee. And so that's already a daunting schedule for anybody with or without a disability, but I have to also build in additional challenges along the way, including in the past, ensuring that I can find a seat in those rooms, including if I'm staffing my ambassador, my permanent representative, or any of our other ambassadors or a delegation from DC, that our seat is in an accessible location, particularly when it comes to informal meetings or side events. And we're talking about challenges and successes, so I want to also really commend our colleagues from DGACM in particular, the USG and ASG and their full teams. I think a very practical example was through the GA revitalization process in 2018, the steering committee under the leadership of Republic of Korea and Antigua and Barbuda put language in there to ensure that accessible seating was made accessible for any delegation that requested it. I'm looking at our Assistant Secretary General and others. It took a few years to get it right, but this is the first year where I can go into meetings, stress-free, knowing that my delegation and other delegation seats are accessible, whether they're coming in for a 1 week, 2 week conference, such as the Commission on the Status of Women, or here year-round. And I should also note, too, that it's not just physical accessibility. We have colleagues with visual impairments who also benefit from being on the aisle and not being up the stairs and having their seats be easily located. And again, at the end of the day, as a delegate, we are staffing our senior leadership. And so we want to, with or without a disability, I've heard many on the panel talk about that. And, coming back, if your seat is not accessible, it doesn't matter if you have a disability or not, your duty is to make sure that your principal is staffed. And then just wanted to also mention a couple of other examples too, and we, as again colleagues in the room from the third committee, we love sleeping at the UN in the third committee, especially those of us working on gender. And so there's an infamous negotiation every March where we're here until 5, 6 in the morning, have about 2 hours to go shower, come back for another 10, 12-day marathon. And so the session right before COVID, which also paved the way for other accomplishments, basically, there's only one way to exit the UN, and it's through a turnstile. So if you're a wheelchair user or you use a guide dog, it is not possible for you to exit. And so I have spent, anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours waiting after hours for an exit to be opened, and it speaks to our committee and the colleagues, and nothing about us without us, and the role of allies. By the second day, we had about 15, 20 delegations who, in the room, maybe disagreed on policy issues, but outside of the room, everybody was united in ensuring and pushing for accessibility. And I'm really delighted to say that there is now an after-hours gate that is functional, that I had a chance to test a few days ago as well, and I'm already I might not be looking forward to the overnight negotiation, but I'm already looking forward to that as well. And then just finally, too, something that we've been working on, and I don't, and with Ambassador Webson and his delegation and others, is making a universal registration process that is not onerous. I've heard our colleagues here talk about the types of questions, and certainly the Washington group's questions are really important, and we use them a lot in our work overseas, but also, no two persons with disabilities, I think every panelist has said it here, are the same. And so having a registration process that doesn't ask, 200 questions, but rather allows a fill-in template to really accommodate each person's reasonable accommodations. We were a bit surprised to see, and I know our colleagues in Geneva had been hard at work, including through the Indigo system, but what was really missing there was those of us that use the UN day-to-day on the member state and the civil society side as well. And so we're continuing to look into that. And then just very quickly, finally, as I know I'll be followed by my colleague from the International Disability Alliance, and she'll hit on some of these issues as well. We've really tried to leverage the steering committee and to work with other processes, including the Conference of States Parties on the CRPD, to continue increasing accessibility. And so the other piece of everything I think others have talked about is attitudinal barriers. I think that the assumption all of us on this panel and many of us in the room get is that we work on disability-specific issues, and I think the majority of us don't, or if we do, it's part of it's the nothing about us without us. And so, the number of times I used to come into the UN and get asked, oh, the disability-specific meeting is happening now, or, if I'm with a delegation, getting asked all sorts of questions. So with all of that, I wanted to commend our colleagues at UNDSS as well. We really, together with our colleagues from civil society and others, did a successful training before the Conference of States Parties this year, and look forward to continuing to engage with DSS ahead of all of the major conferences as well. And I could tell you already that I literally the next day you could already see the impact, and I've seen it not just during the CRPD, and I look forward to hearing from our colleagues speaking after me as well. So just giving you a few very practical examples and of challenges and successes, and on this day we have a lot to celebrate and have a long way to go, and again look very much forward to working with our colleagues at the UN and civil society. Thank you.
Hey, Jen, you want to talk about the break?
Yes, I'm sure everyone is waiting. But thank you so much for that wonderful insight and all the stories you shared. I think nothing about us without us, and really nothing without us. I think that sums it up. So now we have a 15-minute break. There's some coffee and teas outside, and the restrooms are to your left and to your right. The morning, or this first part, was really about listening to the UN organizations and holding us accountable to where we are and where we're going. And the second part will really be about good practices, as Gopal was saying, not best practices, but good practices from external organizations. So we're really looking forward to that learning segment. See you at 3:30. Thank you. Welcome back. I hope you had a good break and had a chance to connect and network and meet some of the wonderful people from today's event. I know a few people are still trickling in, but we've still got a fantastic program ahead, so we're going to kick off. And I'm absolutely delighted to now introduce Bethany Brown from the International Disability Alliance. She's a human rights advisor there, and she will talk to us about the employment of persons with disabilities. Over to you, Bethany. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the UN Office of Human Resource Management for inviting the International Disability Alliance to join this important discussion today. We're really delighted to support this work. As was noted, my name is Bethany Brown. I am using a wheelchair. I have brown hair and white skin and green glasses. For those who may not know us, the International Disability Alliance is a network of 8 global and 6 regional organizations of persons with disabilities and their families. We represent over 1,000 organizations of persons with disabilities in 182 countries around the world. I'm going to sort of take us up to either 10,000 feet or take us back to the basics, depending on how you want to look at it. As the International Disability Alliance, we speak for ourselves as a representative organization of persons with disabilities. And we work with our members and our members' members to create change in countries around the world. We advocate here at the UN for a more inclusive global environment for everyone. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, I'll just be talking about it as the convention, it's really our touchstone. And we're here today to talk about employment. There is a right to work and employment in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And when we talk about what barriers are to our employment, I'm not going to get into a lot of specifics, but it is notable that this is particularly true for underrepresented groups of persons with disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, people with psychosocial disabilities, and people with deaf blindness. They face really significant barriers to their employment. The employment gap is also larger between women with disabilities from women without disabilities. And while there is a lack of reliable and comparable data, available information shows persistent lower rates of employment for persons with disabilities. As I said, human rights are our touchstone. So today I'm talking about human rights. I'm linking up some different rights, and then I'll highlight some of the more specific mechanisms that we have here at the UN. I am talking about employees with disabilities across the board. And I think we've heard a lot. We've just had that great presentation of some specific experiences of employees. And this is to sort of underpin some of the important stories and examples that we've heard. So we'll start out at the most basic level. We all have value. We all have something to offer. Not in a capitalistic or productivity-based way, but in our humanness. We each have something to give others, for others to receive by virtue of our humanness, by virtue of our being. And we have a problem. We have societies that aren't structured to accept that have barriers to having us all have participation. They aren't structured to include persons with disabilities. This includes workplaces, both formal and informal. We also have real barriers to our own and others' understanding of ourselves as equals. This is ableism, or discrimination against persons with disabilities. And that's where the specific articulation of our human rights comes in. Countries can choose to ratify and be held accountable for our rights through the CRPD, through the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And one way to understand what that really means is to frame human rights as what governs the relationship between governments and people. And we lay the responsibility squarely at the feet of government for protecting us from practices that limit our rights through laws and regulations and enforcement that respect our human rights. The convention uses a social model of disability. So impairment combined with a barrier makes a disability. In the same way, my using a wheelchair or my boss being blind is not the problem. The problem is the external barriers that we face that are the problem. The doors without ramps and the websites that can't be read by screen readers are the problem. And the convention makes that the fundamental tenet of what we're working on here, what we need to change. It's not us that needs to change, it's how we structure and organize ourselves that need to change. Our voices are organized through representative organizations of persons with disabilities, like the International Disability Alliance, IDA. OPDs are those that are governed, led, and directed by persons with disabilities. They're comprised by a majority of persons with disabilities themselves and are thus representative. Further, they have a clear majority of membership that's recruited among persons with disabilities. This is more fully fleshed out in the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is the treaty body that interprets the CRPD's General Comment 7 from 2018. It explains how meaningful consultation with and involvement of persons with disabilities through their representative organizations is necessary to the development and implementation of policies and programs for the convention. Of course, in the convention, we have the right to work and employment in Article 27, and the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has a general comment on the right to work and employment, which came out just this September. Some important aspects of the employer-employee relationships that human rights govern are accessibility and reasonable accommodation. Persons with disabilities can't enjoy our right to work and employment on an equal basis with others in the absence of accessibility. I'm going to make sure that we're all on the same page about what the distinctions are between accessibility and reasonable accommodation. Accessibility applies to groups stemming from the prohibition on discrimination. Persons with disabilities should have equal access to all goods, products, and services that are open or provided to the public in a manner that ensures their equal and effective access and respects their dignity. The points that my colleague Sophia from the U.S. Mission raised really illustrate accessibility in very, very practical ways. Then there's reasonable accommodation. This applies to individuals. It can be used as a means of ensuring accessibility for an individual with a disability in a particular situation. This could mean, for example, offering a quieter seat to an employee who uses dictation software so there isn't background noise interrupting the production of their work. It does not place an undue burden on the entity involved. The duty to provide reasonable accommodation happens from the moment that a person with disabilities seeks to exercise their rights or requires access in non-accessible situations or environments. Inaccessibility and the denial of reasonable accommodation are discrimination. The committee emphasizes that reasonable accommodation duties are different from accessibilities. While they both aim to guarantee accessibility, the duty to provide accessibility through universal design or assistive technologies is a duty that's built into systems and processes without regard to the needs of a particular person with disabilities. Protection from discrimination also extends to discrimination by association, which we heard a little bit about earlier in the day. This may occur when family members or a person who is associated with a person with a disability is discriminated at work because of this relationship. and the denial of the rights of that person has a direct or an indirect impact on the life of persons with disabilities. So that covers some of the most basic elements of employer relationships. Here at the UN, we also have the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, adopted in a General Assembly resolution calling on the UN system to implement and report on it. When launching UNDIS in 2019, the Secretary General committed the UN to lead by example and raise its standards on disability inclusion across all pillars of its work, from headquarters to the field. We've heard a bit about that, and as Miguel noted earlier, this was intended to make the UN an employer of choice for persons with disabilities, so that those fundamentals of the protection of our rights in employment should be well addressed in this system. We heard about where some of the shortcomings are on that already. We're glad that there's a roadmap. We're glad that there are scorecards being kept on this. We have this great expression, marking our own homework. And it's really, really easy to mark your own homework and point out the things that you're doing or that you've tried to do. And having a UN scorecard is one way to keep people from being able to completely mark their own homework in the system. And we really appreciate that. It was also developed in consultation with organizations of persons with disabilities. We have some other things here at the UN that we're excited about too. The Joint Inspection Unit's report on accessibility, which offers some real, mostly free guidance on how to make the UN more accessible for all. We have ongoing resolutions on accessibility in the 5th Committee and in the 3rd Committee as well. And hats off to the work of the Accessibility Steering Committee and DGACM and the PGA for their efforts to offer etiquette training in the week ahead of the Conference of States Parties. That was really well attended. And we did see concrete differences in the interactions that took place during the Conference of States Parties, just from having one training session, which we hope will become a regular occurrence. There are, of course, plenty of other initiatives here at the UN that affect the UN's work outside the UN as well. One of the most important is the Sustainable Development Goals, which has Goal 8 on decent work. And I would urge everyone to look at that. The UN's CRPD, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is meant to be both a development and human rights instrument. And so we take those sustainable development goals very seriously for the way that the UN is conducting its work outside, as well as its employment here within the UN confines. The one thing that I want to underscore, that I want to make sure that you come away with, is something that's already been mentioned: nothing about us without us. The idea of participation. Persons with disabilities, through our representative organizations, must be at the table as plans to improve employment opportunities are created, whether that's here at the UN, whether that's in private organizations, whether that's in public employment. As an alliance committed to the rights of persons with disabilities around the globe, we really look forward to partnering with you for an inclusive future here at the UN. And thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I wish us all a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bethany, for taking us all the way up, but also just grounding us very much, and for all the incredible work that you and your organization are doing. So we're now moving into the segment where we're going to hear from some incredible external partners on some of the good practices they have. So I would like to invite all of our partners up on stage, if you're not up already. That would be the Kessler Foundation, Microsoft, Salesforce, TCS, and JP Morgan Chase. Feel free to clap. And there are some name tags, so you might have to find yours. And also we're a little bit flexible with our timing. I think we'll be running behind by about 10 minutes. We're going to move away with the Q&A, but if you do have any questions, you can send them to us, so we'll get to that. But we want to make sure that the panel has enough time to share the great insights. So I'm going to hand back over to my partner with purpose. Jim, over to you.
Thank you. I bet you say that to all the boys, so I appreciate that. You know, the private and nonprofit area in terms of people with disabilities is fascinating, and I think that our nonprofits around the world, you know, really try to do a fine job. I learned in my career with IBM and, you know, my latest career with JP Chase is that, you know, when businesses get involved, I see things happen. And we've seen a lot of things happen in the disability space when I was at IBM and at Chase, where I was the managing director of the Office of Disability Inclusion. And the partners engaged with this, and the Kessler Foundation, Microsoft, Salesforce, Tata Consultancy, and JP Chase are some of the finest organizations in the world. And they have stories to share about how they did, or we did at Chase, disability inclusion. So in today's Partners in Progress session, we will hear exciting news and reports from the famed Kessler Foundation, Microsoft Company, Salesforce, Tata Consultancy Services, and JP Chase. The briefings I heard from these organizations were superb and made me proud to hear their leadership programs engaging their company communities and the worldwide marketplace regarding disability inclusion. I'd like to remind our speakers, when I call on you, to introduce yourself using visual descriptions as well. And in the matter of time, we're looking at about 8 minutes each. So let's be the private sector, be tight, be precise, get it done, okay? So I think we'll start with the Kessler Foundation, and I'm pleased to have Elaine Katz and Dr. John O'Neill joining us today. Elaine and John, you know, you'll introduce yourselves, tell a little bit about what you do, but I'm intrigued by the recent survey that you guys performed in partnership with the University of New Hampshire to examine the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on people with disabilities. And you can give us some background on the survey. So Elaine and John, I'll let you start.
Hi, everybody. What do I do? Okay. I'm John O'Neill. Oh, yes. Now I can hear myself. I'm a white male with gray hair and a gray beard. I'm wearing a tan jacket, and I'm going to talk about our Kessler Foundation National Employment and Disability Surveys. Two in particular. One is, well, they're both surveys of supervisors in organizations around the country. We did our first supervisor survey in 2017, and which included over 6,000 individuals, 6,000 supervisors from private, public, and government organizations with 25 or more individuals. And we also conducted a supervisor survey this year in May and June of 3,800 supervisors, asking basically the same questions, but in the second survey, it was we added some questions on COVID-19. So what I'd like to do is just kind of review the results briefly in terms of start with the COVID-19 findings. Almost half of the supervisors this year reported that COVID-19, the pandemic, had a moderate or large negative effect on their organizations. One example of that is almost 40% of the supervisors reported moderate to large decreases in the number of employees. We often refer to that as the Great Resignation, and in fact, these supervisors did experience that. Almost 50% of the supervisors reported a moderate to a large increase in the percent of paid employees working from home, and they did expect that to continue deeply into the future. And almost 80% reported that their organization established or changed their accommodation processes due to issues created by COVID-19. So, almost 80% also said that supervisors who worked in organizations with established accommodation processes said that their organization used those established processes for employees who requested accommodations due to COVID-19. In addition, supervisors who supervised employees with long COVID, about 58% of them stated that employees received accommodations. So I think our businesses, our private businesses, our state governments, and even Kessler Foundation have experienced new and revived looks at the use of accommodations as a result of COVID-19. I'd also like to spend a little bit of time talking about the changes that we saw in our comparing the basic questions that we asked in the 2017 and 2022 surveys. I'd like to just comment on the improvements that we saw. One improvement, and this is in basically 4 areas. The first area is recruiting practices. Supervisors reported that overall their organizations there were more organizations that had put in place formal recruiting processes. Also, there were supervisors reported partnering with disability organizations to help qualified persons with disabilities, to recruit qualified persons with disabilities. More of these organizations were doing that. Supervisors also said that they were being trained, more of them were being trained in accessible application and interview techniques. And also, more of the organizations were putting into place audit hiring procedures to ensure disability accessibility. There were also increases in practices related to onboarding and training. More supervisors were saying that they were training people on site, and they were doing it themselves or coworkers were. That is, training people with disabilities. They also were more of them were using job shadowing to train individuals with disabilities. And probably as important, which is important, is that more supervisors were reporting using short-term outside assistance for training their individuals that they had hired, which I think probably is speaking to, at least in some degree, supported employment. Supervisors also commented on accommodation practices. There were more supervisors were reporting formal processes for requesting accommodations. They were also reporting that it was much more common for more organizations had centralized accommodation funds, which we heard that the UN has that, which is very positive. Also, more organizations were using flexible work schedules. And obviously, more organizations were allowing people to work from home at least some of the time. Finally, in terms of retention practices, more organizations were training employees regarding disability issues and cultural competence. And also, the more organizations were reaching out to receive consultation through government resources or otherwise regarding accommodations. Just I'd like to put this in the context of the fact that these improvements amongst these many organizations that we surveyed. During COVID, everyone at the beginning, people with and without disabilities, there was, as we all know, there was a steep decrease in the rate of employment. Since COVID, people with disabilities have performed better, and they've returned to their employment rates. They're actually people with disabilities are their employment to population ratio is above their pre-pandemic level, and actually it's at historic highs. And by historic, the 6 questions that were added to the Bureau of Labor Statistics survey, those are the 6 questions that they used to define disability, and those questions were added back in 2008, and currently people with disabilities are above that historic high, whereas the people without disabilities are still not at their pre-pandemic levels. So, and people with disabilities stayed engaged in the labor market more readily and significantly after COVID. I sort of think, possibly, that something is happening here. Employers are getting the word, possibly. Supervisors are telling us that they're more likely to be using, many more supervisors are using disability employment practices that are positive. And people with disabilities are returning to the labor market to a greater degree after COVID, relatively, to those without disabilities.
Let me just add really quickly, I'm kind of going to switch gears here and talk a little bit about the tools. So you heard this morning, a little bit earlier rather today, about a new UN online tool that was created to employ people with disabilities. And Kessler Foundation has partnered with the Society for Human Resource Managers, some of you may know it as SHRM, and we've created an online platform called Employabilities at Work. And, you know, this was created, we were approached last year to create this to help fund it. And the reason we did fund it is because I'm sure, like most of you, we often hear, we want to hire people with disabilities, and I know the UN has said this, where do we find people? How do we engage them? We don't know what to do. And that's what this platform is really designed to do. So this is a 7-module course, takes about 10 hours. It's free. It's available to anybody in the world. You don't have to be a SHRM member. If you complete it, you do get a certificate, and if you happen to be a SHRM member, you get credits towards their certification process. And what it really allows you to do is it helps you understand the barriers to employment experienced by individuals with disabilities. It formulates a business case, helps you develop the business case that you may need for your team. And really, it gives you the baseline with some guidelines on how to build an inclusive and equitable workforce for really recruiting and hiring and developing talent. One of the interesting things that we heard from Irina this afternoon is, and we've seen through our surveys, is that people with disabilities are hired at companies when the top really makes that dictate. So, you may have a rule or regulation that comes down from corporate headquarters or another certifying body that says we are going to employ people with disabilities. But unless that comes down locally, and I do mean locally, unless your local office and those supervisors in that office want to really hire people with disabilities, a manager may hire one person, but it's not going to happen across the board. And we saw that in our survey, and this SHRM tool also helps you with that DEI, and we also add now the big A, accessibility strategy for educating your team, which we saw in our survey well. So, you can do everything you want to try to hire people with disabilities, but if you don't educate your current staff and promote that culture, it's really not going to happen. So, besides the survey, which can be used as it's a real research tool, so you can use that as justification as part of your strategic plan. But really, you need to think about what comes next. And we heard a little bit today, who are you hiring? How are you making them comfortable? How are you making your accessibility process available for those who want to interview for you? And I just want to conclude the Kessler portion by saying, these are tools in your toolbox you can have. The surveys are online. Employing abilities at work can be found also online. And we hope you'll use them, and they become a basis for your journey on increasing hiring for people with disabilities. And I'm going to turn it back now to Jim.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. Terrific. It's the sessions today were great with progress, which is what I've always dreamed of. More progress, less talk. So let's keep this thing going. Thank you very much. We'll move to Rylan Rogers at the Microsoft Corporation. I say one of the leaders in disability inclusion and accessibility.
Thanks so much. My name is Rylan Rogers. I'm the Disability Policy Advisor at Microsoft. I'm a white woman with brown and increasingly white hair sitting in front of you wearing a black dress, and I have a non-visibly apparent disability. It's great to be a part of this conversation today and really to be able to share some of our experiences on this journey of accessibility. And I love the word journey because this is not a place that has an endpoint. We have to continuously invest. Like many businesses, we think about accessibility in terms of both product and talent, and they really are interrelated concepts. The product piece is probably apparent to many of you when you think about Microsoft. Starting from decades ago when we had, many of us think of as the first accessibility feature in technology and the sticky key function, to where we are now in a world that has rapidly become digital and where access to community and having full access to our world requires digital access. And in that frame, we're looking at products across our offering and making sure that accessibility features are built in, features that meet the needs of a wide variety of experiences. So we might think very clearly about different types of disability, but knowing that we need to be broad and inclusive when we're thinking about what accessibility means. And I think that's important to know that that frame is there, that emphasis and that priority. Because one of the things being when you raise your hand and you say, I'm Rylan from Microsoft, is I have the ability for all of you to complain about what's missing in Microsoft's features. And really, we desperately need you to continue to complain about what you need in terms of accessibility, because it's the voices of disabled users and companies that are bringing that talent inside that helps us continue to evolve. So this has really been a journey. So that's the product side. The talent side is critical because in order to build delightful, accessible products, we need the talents of everyone. And critically, we need disabled talents to bring their perspective, their thinking, and their experience to our development team. The talent journey at Microsoft started in the same way that it started and referenced in a variety of ways today, with a small employee resource group. And actually, it was several small employee resource groups where people were coming together around lived experience with a type of disability or lived experience as a family member around a type of disability. Over time, that has grown to a cross-disability ERG, employee resource group, with chapters around the globe. So that change really helped to drive the shift of where we are in thinking about talent and thinking about bringing talent in. Some of the references to how do you do great hiring, how do you create career paths for disabled talent are part of our journey as well. We certainly have intentional recruitment, looking to bring those perspectives to Microsoft. We're very intentional about accessibility through the hiring process to allow folks to let us know what they need to bring them their best selves to their candidate experience so that we can find and use that talent. And we've learned over time that we need to be intentional, that we need to think about who's missing from our hiring, and in some cases develop specific programs to recruit around that. And that's led to a very robust neurodiversity hiring program. And then another program that I don't think we talk about enough, but I'm particularly passionate about, which is the fact that we've thought very clearly about the needs of having folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities bringing their talents to our campuses globally, and that happens through partnerships with vendors and our supported employment program. So really thinking about who's missing, how do we get those folks to the table, and how do we move things forward. Over time, our journey has had lots of pieces and parts, and I wanted to share a few things that I think are nuggets that we can each use and learn to move forward. One was already referenced, and that's the importance of leadership. You know, Microsoft has strong leaders who talk about the value of accessibility, who talk about the need of disabled talent. We have an organization that has a chief accessibility officer, and we use a hub and spoke model where everyone ultimately is responsible for accessibility and reports to that chief accessibility officer. We also haven't limited it to the accessibility team or that chief accessibility officer. The need to allow a space where talent across our leadership team can be out and open about their disability status has really been transformative in recruitment and retention. It really echoes Elaine's point that you can't have just the top talk about it. It has to be across the world, and you have to create an opportunity for people to bring their whole selves to work. So that's been an important part, that climate where we can have out leadership. One of the things that's been an interesting learning for me, relatively new to Microsoft, is the investment that's been made in space, physical space, and digital space, allowing folks to come in so that when our real estate team is either building a new building or renting a new space, there are clear standards to try to make that space as built in a universal design fashion as possible. It's small things that I don't even see anymore that make my ability to move around the building easier. It's the idea that no matter whether I have an employee in my same physical space who uses Braille, all of the, very important free drinks are labeled in Braille so that when we have a visitor coming to our office, they can make a choice based on their preferences. So really those small, subtle touches and intentional designs have created a space where you are welcome to bring your whole self to work, and we are saying intentionally you are wanted here. And I think those pieces that we underappreciate in our real estate team has made a critical difference. We've already talked about the importance of accommodations and the value of a central accommodation fund. Taking that question of the cost out of the line of the supervisor has been a critical lesson learned. One place where we've sort of taken it up a notch that's really fun is we're trying to move as many as possible, is that even the right words? But to take software and technology that are used as accommodations and create it that anyone can access it, whether or not you identify as disabled, whether or not you've raised your hand in terms of an accommodation. This creates a really interesting sort of leveling of the playing field. We see some of our colleagues who don't identify as disabled using JAWS for the first time because they didn't have to ask for it. And it's that really, I like to watch it and sort of see that digital curb cut effect. What's happening when we're normalizing the use of what previously is seen as assistive technology, when we can remove those barriers. So I think that's an interesting piece. That's also been critical in terms of making space, and I mentioned the physical space. A huge investment that we've made in the last year and a half is there is required training for everyone who works at Microsoft. Whether or not you identify accessibility as a part of your job, you must take accessibility training. And it has created a nice culture change. And it's sort of multiple parts of the training that are critical. One piece is sort of the basics. You know, what are the language preferences around disability identity? What are our standards and how we host meetings? Those types of things. It gives people a safe place to learn that information without feeling like they're asking an awkward question. The other piece that I really love about this training, and this is a part that too often as a disabled person and a member of the disability community I saw as the training that was offered just to people with disabilities, but in our case, we're offering training around the accessibility tools that are part of our work for everyone. And that just makes good sense. It's kind of odd and not at all surprising that when we only train the disabled person around the technology, that when there's a problem, there's no one there to help. And instead, when we're all responsible together for how accessible technology works, then there's lots of layers of help and support. It also reinforces that culture that accessibility is the responsibility of everyone. So at Microsoft, we have spell check built in. We also have an accessibility checker built in. And so the idea that before you send an email at Microsoft to your colleagues, you need to check the accessibility. And that's whether you know that your email is going to somebody who uses a screen reader or whether you don't know at all. So using those tools, learning about it in training has been a critical part of the culture change. One of the pieces about the talent that we're also aware of and has been referenced by multiple speakers today is that we need to invest in the pipeline. That the talent of people with disabilities and the background in accessibility and accessible technology isn't where we need it to be as a global society. We need more great minds focused on this. And so bringing that message, having those conversations and making those investments has been incredibly important. I want to tell you a little bit about what we're focusing on now, because I think it's a really important piece. It's what brought me to Microsoft. About a year ago, they focused on the disability divide and really in 3 key areas. How do we close the gap of what people with disabilities experience and people without disabilities? The first, kind of obvious for Microsoft, technology. So really, how do we make sure that there is a delightful experience and that technology is meeting the needs of everyone to empower them to do more? The second is incredibly important, and Microsoft can't do it alone. But we're off to a great start, perhaps because of COVID, but perhaps because of other things. And that's a commitment to close the unemployment gap, to make sure that the talents of disabled people are part of every business, part of every public sector, private sector, globally, that we are closing that gap and we are ceasing the practice of leaving people behind in terms of employment. And then the third is probably my favorite, really an effort to look at those societal barriers of inclusion and figure out where as a company do we bring value to the conversation to modernize policy. And I've seen lots of sort of tiny pieces of some of the things that we're working on mentioned today. One that I thought was critical is transportation. We know that our employees with disabilities getting to and from work, unfortunately, is an extra barrier or tax on their experience in too many cases. And then really importantly, travel. How do you get to a meeting? How do you get to a site? And making sure that we're addressing the policy changes so that travel is more fully accessible to close those societal gaps. So those are a little bit of hints of where we're looking. We're very interested on figuring out how our voice, how our perspective and experience can help modernize public policy to help close some of those gaps. It's a personal passion of mine. And we're interested in partnering with each of you, sharing our lessons learned, sharing our tools, hearing about what we're not getting right as we together with you continue on this journey to reach the needs of everyone. And I'll turn it back.
Thank you, Rylan. You almost got me standing up with that presentation. Thank you very much. It's excellent. It's just excellent. Salesforce with Amy Wood. Amy, can you tell us a little bit about Salesforce and what you guys are doing over there?
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm Amy Wood, and I work for Salesforce in the Office of Accessibility. My pronouns are she, hers, and I am a white female with dark gray hair, a lot of gray hair, and I am wearing a gray blazer. So I work at Salesforce, and we are a technology company out of San Francisco with about 78,000 employees, and we follow Microsoft faithfully in their accessibility endeavors. So I just wanted to share with you our journey at Salesforce when it comes to accessibility. It started in 2019 when the Office of Accessibility was launched. Up until then, a majority of the disability advocacy had been done by the ERG group that we have, which is AbilityForce. But all of these employees with disabilities already had their day jobs. They were working in marketing, they were working in engineering and real estate. They didn't have time to go to meetings and knock down doors to ask for accessibility. We needed a centralized office that could create and execute a strategy around disability inclusion, specifically around our product, our workspaces, recruiting, and also events. We have many events every year across the globe. So in 2019, we launched the Office of Accessibility to drive thought leadership across the industry and drive accountability and compliance in our company. So disability inclusion is extremely essential to our culture of equality. So Salesforce operates on 5 values, which are kind of our guiding principles, which is innovation, customer success, sustainability, equality, and trust. Trust is the other one. So because we rely on equality as a very fundamental part of our workspace, it's a goal of ours to cultivate a culture where employees feel empowered by their abilities and their talents. And employees are telling us that they want to work for a company that not only cares about accessibility, but will do whatever it takes to create a workspace where they can come and do their best work and not worry about how to get that job done. Fortunately, our champions for accessibility start at the top. Mark Benioff is the CEO and co-founder of Salesforce, and he has championed accessibility throughout. And he also signed the Are You In campaign in 2020. In 2020, Disability In had an Are You In campaign where multiple CEOs signed a pledge to show their commitment to accessibility. And we also have another co-CEO, Brett Taylor, who on every product call, he is asking about accessibility. What are we doing with this product? How can people with screen readers use it? How can people who are deaf use it? And then also one other person is Ebony Beckwith. She is Mark Benioff's chief of staff. And she is also our executive sponsor for AbilityForce. So to have very visible leaders that are pushing for accessibility really helps us prioritize that for our company. So many of the top challenges that we have at Salesforce is reaching 78,000 employees across the globe. We are trying to reach as many people to encourage them to self-identify and to let them know what accommodations we have available. And we also are trying to reach everybody to help incorporate accessibility into their work stream, whether they're working in marketing or in real estate or engineering or sales. And another challenge is prioritization, and everything is a high priority. And we constantly have to remind ourselves to not boil the ocean. And so we can just take everything one day at a time to focus on the task and get that done. So some of the ways that we overcome these challenges is we are evangelizing best practices higher and wider. And when I say higher, I mean with leadership. We are going higher and higher with leadership and sharing best practices and really just talking about the benefits of disability inclusion. And when I say wider, we are talking globally, so we can go to other countries and also share best practices. The best part of Salesforce is that we follow ADA requirements in other countries, because sometimes those standards may not be the same as it is here in America. And we also utilize the ERGs to share information, to learn more about challenges, and to partner with the community. So we know that accessibility is not easy. We rate success. Any progress is success. Whether it is big or small, we consider it a win. And a huge win is when we can embed accessibility into a program or a product and making it easy, streamlined, and repeatable. For example, we do have a win here. We now have an automatic prompt to schedule closed captioning services or interpreter for any meetings. And in the past, it was a very clunky experience, and sometimes people didn't know how to schedule interpreters, but now we have an automatic prompt for that. Accommodation requests are now built into job application and recruiting scheduling. So if a candidate with a disability needs an accommodation, it's already built into the job application where they can ask for what they need. And then, and the last thing is we also have accessibility prompts when we are building new technology. So that leads to creating enablement tools that are accessible to all. I'm going to wrap it up here. So the next steps, we recognize that we just have so much to do. We are better, never done. We need to get really good at what we do, and that does require prioritization. But Salesforce gives us the space to prioritize accessibility, and that's how we're getting better. We make the best progress through collaboration, mistakes, and transparency. And we don't always get it right, but we are always going to get up and keep trying and knocking down doors. And the vision for our company, or for the Office of Accessibility, we have gotten feedback that says the Office of Accessibility has provided a new perspective on the journey to accessibility. We are considered by many to be a true partner by providing resources, guidance, and support to every team that needs it. We've achieved our vision of creating an environment where everyone is encouraged to openly share what's going on and opportunities that we can be better. We've only just begun, but we have learned so much, and we know that we have made an immeasurable impact. So I'm just going to end it here. Before I came here today, I asked my team, where do you see the future of disability inclusion in 10 years? And my leader had a response that I just found so eloquent, so I wanted to share that with you as I'm closing. Catherine Nichols is the Vice President of the Office of Accessibility. The community of people with disabilities is only growing. The awareness of the benefits of inclusive design is growing. Businesses are finally taking on and being held accountable for their accessibility. Roles are being created around accessibility. The younger generation is more aware of what they need to be successful and are encouraged to ask for it. So I am hopeful for a more accessible and inclusive world in 10 years. I don't want to be young again, but it would be nice to have that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that. We're running short on time, so I'll have Tada come up right now and get started. We're about 5 or 6 minutes in, okay?
Sure. My name is Preeti DeMello. I'm the Global Head of Culture and Diversity at the Lead Academy for Tata Consultancy Services. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I consider myself an ally to all diverse communities. I'm deeply aware that the diversity of my mind is a process of learning and unlearning, and I'm committed to intentionally enhancing my understanding and growing to be more empathetic and considerate. For the purpose of description, I'm 57, I'm from the Indian subcontinent, I have salt and pepper hair, I wear glasses, and I'm wearing a hand-woven bright green sari, which is the traditional outfit from where I come. Today, our workspaces and our workforce are interdependent ecosystems that aim to be humanistic, culturally connected, inclusive, and adaptive. Amongst these interdependent ecosystems, the disability dialogue has been shifting, and the paradigm to recognize that persons with disability are critical contributors to the global economy as our clients, our employees, taxpayers, and consumers at large. This carries significant weight, especially when the community is more than 1 billion people worldwide. And for those who need an additional imperative, attending to disability inclusion is a smart and strategic thing to do. Including minds and expertise that are beyond the typical is wise and has long-term impact on culture and innovation. Now, even though the beauty and benefit of inclusion is immense, I believe organizations as a reflection of society and society at large have been challenged by social norms, resulting in the resistance to embrace anything which does not conform or is defined as not normal or mainstream. At TCS, we have worked diligently to carve our inclusion journey, and this often makes us outliers in the global economy. The disability journey at TCS is a continuation of an inclusion ethos established by our forefathers, Sri Jamshedji Tata, 150 years ago. His words echo strongly in my heart. He said, "In a free enterprise, the community is not just another stakeholder in business, but it is in fact the very purpose of its existence." Our commitment to inclusion without exception is driven by its value of respect for every individual and its conviction that business advantage is derived from the diverse workforce of over 600,000 people over 45 countries. The TCS diversity strategy and our subsequent disability inclusion strategy is to create and sustain a culture of equity and belongingness, with a focus on creating a whole system inclusion culture and specific attention to all diverse identity segments, including disability. We do this through our 5-pillar approach. Pillar 1 is representation, where we ensure that all diverse identity segments are represented through hiring, allocation, role alignment, engagement and retention, and career progression. Pillar 2 is enablement, where we look at creating systems that provide equitable workplaces for all diverse identity segments with the help of policy, infrastructure, access, and accommodation. Pillar 3 is engagement and connecting with and creating networks of diverse communities through our ERGs, our Community Connects, and allyship networks. Pillar 4 is ecosystem, creating a workplace environment where employees can interact with each other in a supportive and bias-free manner. And there's a focus on the experience of every employee. We believe that a deliberate focus on learning helps us change our minds. That brings us to Pillar 5. And here we focus on educating the entire ecosystem, those who belong to the, so to speak, underrepresented communities and all the others. This is done through capability and capacity, skills and behaviors, leadership and role model connects, coaching and mentoring in groups and individuals. Essentially, at TCS, our scope of diversity keeps expanding, and we continue to focus on creating workplaces that are inclusive in nature through protective policies, proactive hiring strategies, creating an aware and supporting ecosystem, building a culture of inclusion, engaging with the community through employee resource groups and developmental initiatives. We are aware and attempt to address the fact that our employees are nuanced individuals with multiple identities, and these intersectionalities is where our attention also needs to be. To further build on how this looks on ground, we have 4 ERGs dedicated to disability inclusion. The first one is Enable. Enable is our employee resource group for employees with disabilities and allies who are committed to creating a fair and inclusive workplace culture. The second one is an offshoot of Enable called PACT, which stands for Parents, Allies, Caregivers Together, and the focus here is on caregivers and caregiving. This ERG is how we at TCS view diversity as layered and acknowledge the presence of roles beyond the regimented compartments of diverse identities. NeuroWonder is our ERG that focuses on neurodiverse individuals and their allies, and this is where the organization's sponsorship for conditions that are less visible but remain stigmatized is visible. Access Power is our ERG and our Center of Excellence for Inclusion, which is key and very broad space for our work currently. In this space, we are streamlining and leveraging our tech advantage, our social accessibility beyond the baseline regular work that we do. I would also like to reference COVID-19 pandemic. It has upended the way we experience work and the way we live our lives. There has been heightened consciousness about equity, inclusion, and diversity in the workforce as the pandemic hit and has closely tied D&I with well-being. So as we embrace and design the new normal, workplaces are being reinvented. Drawing from our learnings from the pandemic, we see the emergence of many novel trends and practices. As we all know, systemic inclusion is the outcome of systemic effort. At TCS, disability inclusion is superpowered by our collaborations with key stakeholders across the organization, where we focus on training our frontline recruiters on inclusive hiring. We have brochures and materials available for inclusive language. We have support on a case-to-case basis when we onboard employees. We have support resource management teams on guidelines for allocation and retention. We facilitate awareness and sensitizations for business, all our units, so that we can partner with employees with disabilities and make sure that any myth or misconception can be resolved. We also recognize that a systemic goal for inclusion is a core component of sustainable workplaces of the future. Whether we like it or not, the future of workplaces is here and now. And to prepare our workforce and ecosystem, we are paying close attention to what we call our 3-point agenda: human and social sustainability, talent, and accessibility. I'll close with a quick roadmap for the future. I would say enabling policies, systems, processes, and access creation, leadership commitment, and we've all spoken about it in some form or the other today, sensitization and education of all, not only those who belong to a specific community, engaging community through ERGs and bringing them in on every committee on accessibility and other decision-making platforms, developing skills, technical and soft, and strategic and operational partnerships. Tata Consultancy is an inclusion outlier because we have committed to inclusion without exception. An equitable, equal, and inclusive workforce is our recipe for the current and future business success. The future is in our hands, and the only way forward is to unlearn our biases, our fears, our discomforts, to fully embrace disability from a place of awareness and empathy. This is possible if we step into our power and leverage our individual and collective privilege to proactively include till it becomes second nature. I invite us all, as individual change makers and conscious businesses, to claim our role in transforming our workspaces into beacons of diversity and inclusion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're down to the last speaker here from JP Chase, Anthony Reynolds. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you, everyone. I am Anthony Reynolds from JP Chase. I'm a black man. I have long, dark, curly hair. I've been told a mini afro. And I also have a goatee with a little bit more gray hair each month. So I have a blue blazer on as well. Well, I want to say this. Truly, thank you, Jim. We're fortunate at JP Chase to have a strong foundation for our disability and inclusion efforts. And we have Jim and his leadership to thank for everything he accomplished over a 5+ year career. As Jim would like to say, laying the pipe. And help our firm build a global infrastructure. Here's just a quick recap of what we were able to accomplish in the past 5 years with Jim's leadership. We now have a streamlined process for assessing and fulfilling employee workplace accommodation needs. We have a global technology employee experience accessibility team that oversees the firm's software accessibility and assistive technology tools. We have an accommodation services team with sign language interpreters, one-to-one captioning services, and live captioning for events and meetings. During Jim's tenure at the firm, we also launched enhanced recruiting practices for job candidates with disabilities, a global neurodiversity strategy, a 24/7 dedicated global help desk for employees with disability. Today, I'm fortunate to be taking Jim's mission one step further to make JP Morgan Chase the bank of choice for people and customers with disabilities. I'm in a relatively new role at JP Morgan Chase. I lead business growth and entrepreneurship for the Office of Disability Inclusion. I'm a former small business owner myself. I had a technology company. So I can identify with the mission. Basically, our team is focused on increasing access to education and technical resources, capital, and growth opportunities for small businesses and entrepreneurs with disabilities. For many reasons, individuals with disabilities continue to turn to self-employment, and small business development as a viable alternative that provides greater control, choice, and flexibility in terms of work schedule. This past year, JP Morgan Chase partnered with the National Disability Institute and commissioned a report that highlighted that 74% of people with disabilities are still outside our labor force. Some of the key findings from this report that I'd like to highlight here small business owners and entrepreneurs with disabilities find success in entrepreneurship versus the workplace because of ability to have flexible control of their work environment, self-sufficiency, and financial well-being. I'd like to highlight a few entrepreneurs that are successful in this space, making impact. Diego Marskel leads an accelerator helping high-growth, high-impact entrepreneurs grow and scale their business, Together International. Currently, JP Morgan Chase has committed $80 million to Techstars to help additional accelerators make impact for entrepreneurs, including entrepreneurs that are disabled. So in closing today, I'd like to wrap up by citing one more finding from the National Disability Institute. Small business ownership in the disability community is not routinely counted nor measured by the United States Census Bureau, the Small Business Administration, or in other small business surveys. At JP Morgan Chase, we want to do everything we can to make sure small businesses and entrepreneurs with disabilities are counted. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share our strategy with you.
Thank you, Anthony. I appreciate the nod. I was proud to be the leader over there, but you did the entrepreneurship thing terrifically. And this is the point. People with disabilities just aren't people who need to be helped. They help us run our businesses. And when people with disabilities see themselves as business leaders, the disability melts away because they are bringing in revenue, they are creating businesses, and they are doing business with people like themselves. That's where the model has to go in the future. So, Anthony, thank you for doing that job. I appreciate the words you gave me. And at that, I think we're done, unless we have someone else to close the session for us.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. We're now moving into the final part, and thank you so much for your patience. We're now having the closing remarks by His Excellency Christopher Lee, Ambassador and Deputy Representative of the U.S., followed by our Undersecretary General Catherine Pollard of the Department of Management, Strategy, Policy and Compliance. If I could ask them both to come up here for the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me. My name is Chris Liu. I am an Asian male in my 50s, sadly, wearing a pretty standard UN uniform of a blue jacket and red tie. I'm here today as one of the co-chairs of the UN Accessibility Steering Committee, and it's an honor to be with all of you. I'm also here in my former capacity. In my previous life, I was the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Labor. And one of my priorities there was to increase opportunities for people with disabilities. Let me first thank the panelists for their insightful presentations and highlight a couple of the key points that I heard. As people have talked throughout the afternoon, innovative solutions are critical to removing roadblocks to accessibility and inclusion. And one of those innovative solutions has to be technology. We have seen in the workplace how assistive technology can be transformative in creating real economic opportunities. Technology can also be very affordable as well. So it's important that we do more to implement it and to adopt best practices already used by the private sector. Because as you've just heard, the world's most innovative companies know that accessibility isn't just the moral thing to do, it's also good for the bottom line. And even as we mark the progress we've made in the area of accessibility, we also need to take stock of the obstacles that remain, and we need to acknowledge where we have fallen short. In the U.S., despite more than 30 years of experience with the Americans with Disabilities Act, we still have a lot of work to do. When it comes to economic opportunities, Americans with disabilities are unemployed at more than twice the rate of Americans without disabilities. Just 1/3 of Americans with a disability are either in the labor force or seeking employment. 1/3. That means 2/3 of people with disability in the richest country in the world are on the sidelines right now. In the U.S., we've also made great progress in improving physical accessibility in our communities and buildings, but just try navigating the streets or sidewalks of New York City. Try taking the subway, and you'll get a small sense of the impediments that people with disabilities face every single day. And we need to acknowledge that more work needs to be done here at the United Nations. During my time as co-chair of the Accessibility Steering Committee, I've met with delegates, I've met with staff, several of whom have spoken at today's session, and they've told me about the obstacles they face in their jobs every day. And they've been frank in telling me that too often the words in the resolutions that we pass in the UN don't match their experiences working in this grand institution. Physical accessibility continues to be an impediment, and I do want to applaud the Secretariat for creating an accessible entrance to the UN building for people in wheelchairs. That was a long time coming, but I had a chance to try it out last week, and it works, and that's important. But we also have to recognize that just being able to access the building is a first step. Wheelchair users speaking in the General Assembly Hall still aren't able to do so behind the rostrum. Delegates who try to navigate this building's complicated corridors and hallways face challenges if they are visually impaired. And there continue to be too many documents and materials and digital platforms that aren't fully accessible to people with visual and hearing impairments. UN staff, as we've heard today, face an additional set of challenges. When I met with UN employees with disabilities, they told me about the challenges in getting accommodation requests approved. They told me that more needs to be done to recruit, retain, and promote employees with disabilities, particularly at the most senior levels. So as we've heard today several times, a central principle of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities is that nothing about us without us. And to truly address the accessibility challenge, we need to listen more to the staff and delegates who work here. So I hope that discussions, important discussions like the one we're having today, happen every day, not just once a year. As we all know, accessibility and inclusion aren't just the right thing to do, they're the smart thing to do. And if we truly want to address the global challenges of the 21st century, we need a workforce and we need a workplace that is truly inclusive. Thank you for having me.
Distinguished delegates, partners, colleagues, friends, good afternoon to you all. Today we gathered to discuss the progress we've made towards fulfilling our pledge to make the United Nations an employer of choice for persons with disabilities. We've heard the achievements, challenges, and vision for a way forward from our UN system organizations, and we've also heard from our partners on different approaches for advancing employment for persons with disabilities. And most importantly, we have heard from persons with disabilities about their own lived experiences. We have made some progress, and we acknowledge that we are still a long way from realizing our goal of being an employer of choice. Persons with disabilities continue to face barriers that limit their full participation in our workforce. We must do better and quickly to realize the rights of persons of disabilities in all areas. The valuable insights that you have all shared with us today will help us in the United Nations as we continue in our efforts to build a truly inclusive workplace where persons with disabilities can thrive and have fulfilling careers. And the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development depends on fulfilling this promise. I'm committed to taking this forward, and I count on your support in advancing this agenda. In closing, I would like to thank all our participants for your contributions and for making this a successful event. Thank you to all the delegates and the partners, the Kessler Foundation, JP Morgan Chase, Microsoft, Salesforce, Tata Consultancy Services, and the International Disability Alliance. Our heartfelt gratitude goes to our friend and moderator, Jim Sinochi, who has supported us over the years, and to our speakers for sharing your invaluable insights and expertise. And thank you, too, to all our UN partners, the UN volunteers, UNDP, UNICEF, our staff union, and the UN Disabilities Group. And to the global community of persons with disabilities, happy International Day. Thank you all for having been here with us today and sharing with us. And we commit to you to taking this important work forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I just want to say a big thank you to the organizing team, in particular, Chidi, Yuichi, Sue, Bashir, the whole Estos team and the whole Office of Human Resources who supported this, as well as all the departments who really made this happen. Thank you so much for all your incredible work, and thank you for being here.